Yeah? Okay, so what I want to do right now and lay out, I want to lay out the big picture for humanity so that we have the big context for everything else we're going to cover today. I love this idea, you know, it's always important to present context, because context gives meaning to content. Big picture gives explanation to little picture. So let's get the big picture here. We couldn't live in a more exciting time than now.
Dare to live it.
Dare to live it. I mean, really. Humanity itself is at a crucial transition point of crisis. All you have to do is look at the news to see it, and it's global. Humanity is approaching what we call the first initiation. We think it could happen this century. We're not sure, but people are looking at this seriously. It's likely that the possibility is this century. And that you remember, you've all heard me talk about how that always crisis is a prelude to an initiation or an expansion. It's called the burning ground. Each one of us individually in our individual lives has to go through many burning grounds. That's when you go through the dip, that's a burning ground. Oh, I'm out of it. Oh, I'm back in it. Oh, I'm out of it. Oh, I'm back into it. Okay? But this time, all of humanity collectively, not just a nation, not just a couple nations, but all of humanity is going through a crisis that is preparatory to what we've long understood as the first initiation. Now, the first initiation, I said, is called the birth of the Christ within the heart. And I want to give you a sense of what this implies for humanity. Number one, just the name itself suggests that love is in the game. I mean, Christ in the heart? Oh my goodness, so what does that mean? It means that when an individual takes the first initiation, if their life is going to offer that to them, it means the heart chakra widens enormously and means that the Christ has another place to reach through. And it causes that individual to really genuinely sense the underlying unitive field of humanity. Because that's what love really is in the higher sense. What is love? Love is the recognition of the underlying unity of all things. It's the law of attraction, if we talk about it in those terms. And when a person takes the first initiation, they become very focused on wanting to make an uplifting contribution to the betterment of that larger whole in some way. You know, it is said that, I'll quote here, it is said that the first degree initiate, quote, assumes the burden of the future, unquote. To assume the burden of the future. That's important. And it's the sense of having a responsibility to the welfare of the larger whole. That's an amazing process. And to assume that burden means to see that burden in a multi-generational perspective. We tend to think about just now, but I think of the Native Americans, you know, who they think in 7 generations. It's the same idea. You have to be thinking the big, long picture here, the big, long picture. So first degree initiate is somebody that is starting to take on that burden of the future. The first degree initiate individually doesn't necessarily know what the responsibility is. In fact, often they're not sure. They just have this strong sense they got to do something. So what do? They bring their talents, their interests into the forefront of their lives, and slowly they are going to navigate themselves to absolute right alignment with purpose. But so there's a couple things to keep in mind here. Is that the first initiation has so much to do with this idea of recognizing humanity's oneness and wanting to facilitate a further recognition by everybody else to that oneness. But it also, from an individual's point of view, if an individual is taking the first initiation or has taken it, it means that they become masterful of, the soul has become masterful of the appetites of the physical dimension of life. In other words, the soul has mastered the physical impulses of the life. Doesn't mean that an individual doesn't have a need for food, or doesn't mean that they don't have a sexual life. But what it means is that the individual, that with those bodily cravings, there's still another part of them that is able to have oversight and regulatory oversight over those cravings. And that's important in the larger picture for humanity, because we have a problem with appetite in society. I mean, really think about it. Consumption is a huge problem around the world. And there's something inherently wrong when 20% of the world's population consumes 80% of the world's resources. Something's wrong. That's wrong relationship. One of the most important things to keep in mind about the first initiation, particularly, actually the subsequent, it's connected to the others as well, but more at the first initiation has to do with the search for right relationship. And that's also something that says something about our purpose, because your purpose is always going to have to do with trying to establish right relationship between things in your life. And it's not just, I don't mean relationship as in interpersonal relationship. That's a piece of it. But it's bigger than that. It's the search for right relationship in all things. What is the right relationship between religion and religion? What is the right relationship between nation and nation, male and female, the larger society to the individual, between humanity and money and resources? What is the right relationship between humanity's existence and Mother Nature? And what happens is that we start to wake up to, in the search for right relationship, we become acutely aware where there's wrong relationship. And that sense of wrong relationship is what triggers us internally. It triggers us to say, that's not the way it needs to be, and I want to do something about it. So always your purpose needs to be addressing something where there's wrong relationship that needs to manifest right relationship. Always. Because, as I said, at this time of human history, where we are now, if humanity is approaching the first initiation, and the first initiation is all about finding right relationship, your soul purpose has to be connected with that same theme. It has to be. It has to be. So what do we see? How do we see evidence of it playing out in the world today? Well, look at the economic crisis we have around the world. That's really growing. And we see more of the inequities of economics. Well, we see more wrong relationship. Hence we've got a huge issue around that the humanity is struggling with now. The rise of the environmental movement is the collective effects of this as humanity moves to this first initiation, because clearly we're seeing wrong relationship between ourselves and how we treat Mother Earth. You know, see the growth of the environmental movement as evidence that we are actually approaching the first initiation. And it's global. It's not just here in Ireland that there's an environmental issue, right? It's everywhere. And so humanity is approaching this initiation, but the burning ground, the hot coals, the crisis, harmony through conflict, the crisis that humanity has to walk across, the coals that humanity has to walk across, are going to be the coals of recognized wrong relationship. That's what it's about. That's why we're suffering. Humanity is suffering, because we're walking across hot coals based upon our growing recognition of wrong relationship, and it's hot, and it's uncomfortable. It burns. Okay? But there's a shining possibility beyond the hot coals. And that's where this is all trying to go. Now, the masses don't know this. The masses don't know this. The masses in general, I'm broadly stating this, but the masses are, that's a group of humanity that hasn't awoken to its own duality yet. What do I mean by that? I mean that, what does it mean to step onto the path in the first place? It means to be able to sense inside yourself that there are really two of you in there, not one. And you have to be very careful to not say that in public because they lock you up.
They want
But-
to save you.
You're dissociative disorders, the psychologist called it.
What would it look like if the human race had actually achieved the initiation? Have you any idea?
Well, what does it look like?
What would it look like?
Well, it would look like that when the whole process is done, an initiation, it's a huge subject, but an initiation is both a process and an event. As an event, we think that it'll take place in this century, depending upon how the new group of world servers manages it. As a process, it's already in process. And it could take decades and decades and decades to go through.
Assuming it had been, the process is completed.
Yeah, at the end of it, you'll see a humanity that truly sees its oneness, and truly not only sees its oneness, but in the systems that are in place throughout the world will be based upon that perception. And that,
Manifest, how would that, like if we were there, how would it look?
well, we would have a much more equitable distribution of resources, to use that example. We would as a collective whole be much more oriented toward recognizing that our goal is not to master Mother Nature and to recognize that we are just constituent parts of Mother Nature. So our attitude toward the environment would be totally different. And we would integrate into our consciousness a fundamental principle that is the core of what the future must hold for us to survive. And that is that no religion has found the truth, but every religion has found a piece of it. No person has found the truth, but every person has found. Imagine what the world would be like if we collectively accepted that principle. It'd be totally different. We're also told that the Christ himself will be walking among us at that time, which is a whole different story. Yeah.
Just maybe some ideas that might be helpful in the sense of your question. In terms of economics, there are things which are being discussed now, like the crisis that's currently happening in Europe with migration. We're having to deal with this question for the first time in a very practical sense. There's also the types of things that are coming out, the suggestions of, in economics, getting rid of tax havens. This is becoming a very real issue now. The notion of being put forward of a Tony tax, where we actually tax transactions on stock exchanges rather than profits, because that would really balance out the whole thing of where profits go, what we do with pension funds. All of those things, for me, are examples of where we're having to deal on a global scale.
Lots of things can be seen in the world of economics, and it will have a huge effect on economics. The first initiation has a lot to do with resource, and so we will see different patterns of economic behaviors. We'll see some sort of for instance, we will see an example. I'll give you one example. In the United States, and I suspect here too, the United States will often govern they have something called GDP, Gross Domestic Product. But GDP is a measure of economic success, but it has, and in fact, economic growth is based upon the percentage of increase in the GDP. But actually, there's a problem with the GDP concept, because the problem is that it measures every economic activity, including things that we don't like in society. Like, for instance, war and the military machine is an economic driver, and that increases GDP. So it's not values driven. It's not values driven. So there's a whole movement around the world right now to slowly support the idea of changing how economics is measured, and imbuing with it a value system that, so that if economics is being generated by something that is harmful to society, then actually it has a negative effect on GDP. you see, as an example. There are lots of people, particularly people that are along the third ray line, in fantastic disciples in the third ray world that are trying to redesign those systems, as an example. So.
I think it's the Kingdom of Bhutan, is it, where they've got, he's put happiness in as a measure of GDP.
Is that so? Okay, well that's interesting. Happiness is a measure of GDP. Yeah, yeah. But you will see elements of it in theology. You will see it. You will see factors of it in education. Like an example of education, just so that you see this. This would be more along the second ray line. So second ray disciples would be much more likely to serve in this way. But for instance, there's a growing movement in my country and in Australia, and I suspect here too, but I'm not sure, of what is called interdisciplinary education, where you might take let's say you take a history class in university, and instead of just having one teacher, you have two. And one's a historian, and the other is, let's say, a psychologist. And so you're actually being presented two streams of thought that relate to history, and it begins to show the interconnected things, because that's much of the solution has to do with recognizing interconnectedness in things in a way that is not present today. There's elements of it in politics, and more and more we're recognizing global interdependence from a political point of view. That's a good sign too. There's indications of it in science. The movement, for instance, from strictly a Newtonian orientation to a quantum perspective is also evidence of that humanity is approaching it, and that's along the fifth ray line, you see. Theology, you have the crisis in religion, so we see that. That's a sixth ray manifestation, and yet we also see the growing movement of what will become eventually the so-called universal theology, which will have the best of all religions as integrated into it. That'll have a much more collective value to all of humanity. The seeds of that are already being planted now.
Film Avatar, see that?
The film, yes, yeah. But I'm thinking about things like right now you see the seeds of the sixth ray preparing for the first initiation through the beginnings of the ecumenical movement that has taken place a few decades ago, which is where different Christian denominations are finding ways of finding common ground. You have the growth of the interfaith movement, which is the big movements of, and then you have the so-called interspiritual movement, which is based upon a recognition of spirituality transcendent to religion itself. These are all great signs along the sixth ray line. So every type of soul, there's 7 soul types, will have their ashram, the ashram that's inspiring them, will incline that person to engage in world betterment in a societal institution that is energetically related to the very stream they're coming forward in. So